Hi, everyone. I hope that's given everybody enough time to come into the webinar. Thanks for your interest in this webinar series, exploring the human, legal, and scientific costs of the Justice Department's China Initiative. My name is Mike German. I'm a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. I and our co-sponsoring organizations, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, the APA Justice Task Force, United Chinese Americans, and Asian Pacific Islander American Public Affairs are pleased to welcome you to this fourth webinar in our series. The previous webinars can be viewed at the APA Justice website. This webinar will focus on how we can empower those impacted by the China Initiative prosecutions, as well as the broader Asian American and immigrant community, to take action to protect their civil rights and advocate for policy reforms to end the unjust scrutiny and racial profiling of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Obviously, there's a legitimate national security and human rights concerns regarding malign behaviors by the Chinese government, particularly with regard to its treatment of its minority Uyghur population and political protesters in Hong Kong. And of course, economic espionage by the Chinese government or any other foreign government agents can be harmful to our economy and our security, and it's an appropriate concern for law enforcement. But the Justice Department and FBI have a history of using potential foreign threats to justify treating some subset of Americans, typically immigrant communities, religious minority communities, and communities of color, as suspects and abuse their civil rights and liberties in the name of national security. In these previous episodes, targeted individuals and communities have too often been left to defend themselves from these bigoted campaigns. Our goal tonight is to talk about what we can learn from this history and how we can use the tools of our democracy, including using the courts to vindicate our rights and exercising our rights to express grievances and petition the government, particularly in federal, state, and local legislatures, to build stronger defenses against injustices that target any community, because we recognize that no community can be safe from unjust government actions unless all communities are safe. You may notice that some of us are wearing yellow whistles tonight. We're wearing them in solidarity with the individuals and communities increasingly targeted by anti-Asian and Pacific Islander hate crimes. You can go to the APA Justice website to learn more about the Yellow Whistle campaign. And you can go to the Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC website to find resources available to fight anti-Asian hate, including a website to report hate crimes, www.standingagainsthatred.org. Some of you have already submitted questions when you registered for this event. If you have questions during the webinar, you can submit them through the Q&A feature. And I'll try to incorporate as many as I can into this discussion as it goes along. I might combine the questions in a way that aren't exactly the way you asked them, but they're designed to get the same information. Please keep in mind, though, that any information submitted through the Q&A function is being recorded for future viewing. So please do not include any personal information that you don't want publicly shared. The discussion today will include providing tips on where you might go to obtain legal services if you need them. We have a remarkable panel from the legal, academic, and policy communities with us tonight, including Susan Lee, a Maryland state senator elected in 2015 and the first Asian American state senator elected in Maryland, and currently the majority whip. She also served 13 years in the House of Delegates and has been a leader in passing landmark laws to fight domestic violence, human and labor trafficking, child and senior abuse, sexual assault, and hate crimes, among others. Next, we have Patrick Toomey, a senior staff attorney and formerly a colleague of mine at the American Civil Liberties Union's National Security Project, where he works on issues related to surveillance and privacy, racial profiling and discrimination, and national security prosecutions. Then we have Frank Wu, who's currently the president of Queens College, City University of New York. He's had a distinguished academic career, previously serving as chancellor and dean of the Hastings Law School in San Francisco and dean at Wayne State University in Detroit, among other postings. He is also the author of Yellow, Race in America Beyond Black and White. Finally, John Yang, who's president and executive director of one of our partner organizations in the webinar, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. He's previously served in leadership positions in the American Bar Association and the National Asian Pacific Bar Association, and was a political appointee in the Obama administration addressing US trade and economics. Welcome to all of you. My first question will go to Frank. Frank, the US government's tendency to view Asian Americans as potential national security concerns isn't new. You've worked on civil rights issues your entire career and wrote a book on it. How does this history inform your concerns about the threats posed by the China Initiative and the legal efforts necessary to oppose this framing?
I became concerned about all of this a few years ago because even though I'm a native-born American, I realized that doesn't protect me from the perpetual foreigner syndrome, that suspicion that I really belong elsewhere, that I'm a sojourner temporarily here, or a spy, a sleeper agent waiting to rise up on orders from Beijing. We've seen that with the violence that's broken out, with the toxic environment during the pandemic, as people of Asian descent, even people not of Asian descent, regardless of their specific ethnic origin, and even if they're third-generation Americans, are told expressly to go back to where you came from before they're spit upon, shoved to the ground so hard as to break bones, stabbed, or shot. Protecting United States security, which I care about deeply, does not require stereotyping, and our national interest is harmed, not helped by racial profiling. We've seen this throughout history, whether it's in hate crimes such as the killing of Vincent Chin in Detroit in 1982, the Japanese-American internment of World War II, when 125,000 individuals, 2/3 of them native-born citizens of this nation, were locked up based on suspicion that because their blood was Japanese, though their citizenship was American, that they would betray their nation, the United States. So for the attendees, I want to say, if you take nothing else away from this, if you have any concerns at all, where you're facing an issue as a scientist or professor, you should hire a lawyer, and nothing any of us say today will constitute legal advice. I became so concerned about these cases because even though, Mike, as you said, they're real cases, and I fully support appropriate law enforcement action, including criminal prosecution, we also need to train people to comply better. What concerned me is the false positives, people who are innocent of all charges. Sherry Chen, Xiaoxing Shi, those two been in the New York Times, on 60 Minutes, they're the most prominent, but they're not alone. Then there are the cases of changing standards, research activity that only a few years ago was being encouraged by the United States government, by major universities, that then became frowned upon, then became criminal, as well as the double standards where people have done something wrong, but it's by no means espionage. I've done behind the scenes work on dozens of these cases, and you look at the headlines, it says this person's a spy, and you realize they're not a spy. Yes, it is true they didn't fill out their forms properly. Maybe they can't account for every dollar. In some cases, they didn't pay their taxes, right? That's not good. That's not right. But it's not being a spy. And I wonder if in some of these cases, if they didn't quite have this color of skin and texture of hair and shape of eyes, if they would have received a slap on the wrist, if someone from HR or research office would have pulled them aside, said, you know, you really need to redo this paperwork. It's like the violence that we've seen in all these viral videos and in the killing of 8 people in Atlanta, 6 of them Asian women. So many people seem to want to deny that race is involved at all, or even dismiss that anything serious happened. Law enforcement officer in that Atlanta case said afterward, oh, he was having a bad day. Thought that was fake news when I first saw it, as if to say, no big deal. That's the rationalization we see in this area as well. So it's not new, just like the violence, the awareness is new. And so we have to stand up and speak out.
Great. And Patrick, the American Civil Liberties Union, where you work, is one of the oldest and largest civil rights organizations in the United States. It formed the National Security Project that you work in after 9/11 to address war on terrorism concerns regarding the impact on civil rights. We'll get to specific examples of your work, but how do you see the China Initiative as fitting into the ACLU's broader mission and specifically the national security projects.
The organizers of these webinars for having me and the ACLU be part of tonight's program. As you mentioned, for the past 100 years, the ACLU has defended individual rights and civil liberties guaranteed by the US Constitution, protecting immigrants' rights, addressing racial injustice, securing voting rights, and ensuring freedom of speech. And amidst all those different efforts, in our view, the China Initiative really brings together two long-running threads in the government's mistreatment and discrimination against Asian Americans. Many of the people joining the program tonight know that the government has gone very far in the 2 decades following 9/11 in its mistreatment and in targeting Black and Brown communities in this country, religious minorities, and has often stretched or outright violated the legal and constitutional limits on government power in the name of national security. And we also know that there is a long strain extending far before 9/11 of animus in this country against the Chinese American community, going back more than a century. And we see the China Initiative as bringing together two of these strands. It is not something completely new and different, but is part of those longer phenomena. And so when we think about these problems and how to address them, we try to think about them in the context of our work on those other longer running issues. And so what we see is many of these strains coming together in the present climate as the government repurposes powers and strategies that it developed after 9/11, especially to disproportionately scrutinize people of Chinese heritage in this country and other Asian Americans who are often lumped in as well. And so the ACLU as a whole, and also the National Security Project specifically, which is part of the legal department at the ACLU, we see these long-running problems manifesting themselves in a number of ways. So you see scapegoating and bigoted or hyperbolic language being used by public officials, including obviously the former president, but also Director Wray of the FBI in describing how the FBI views the problem that it's tackling in the China Initiative. And that language, that overbroad language feeds into wider discrimination and violence in the public sphere. We see discriminatory investigations of Chinese Americans by the FBI and a host of other agencies that have been kind of co-opted into the China Initiative, where investigations appear to be based on ethnicity or national origin. We see coming up again serious problems in the FBI's investigative guidelines. There's a document that I know you know well, Mike, and others have probably heard of, called the FBI's Domestic Investigations and Operations Guide. And that has a set of rules for how the FBI is supposed to conduct investigations here in the United States. One of the major problems with that guide is that it sets very low or vague thresholds for different types of criminal investigations, which because of their vagueness, because the threshold is so low, are prone to abuse and to becoming used as proxies for profiling or discrimination. And there are also specific DOJ policies that contain carve-outs permitting the use of race and ethnicity when the government invokes national security, when it claims that national security is involved. And so one of the things we've done in coalition with our allies for many years is to advocate for more stringent, demanding standards when the FBI wants to initiate that type of criminal investigation, which can wreak havoc on the lives of people who are subject to those investigations and their families. We also see the overzealous use of powerful national security tools like FISA surveillance, including in the case of individuals like Professor Xiaoxing Shi, who we help represent in his civil lawsuit. And we also see aggressive questioning and searches of Chinese Americans or Chinese citizens at the border, where people are extremely vulnerable to government coercion, notwithstanding their legal rights. So that's a set of the problems that we see arising in this context. And we'll get into, I know, more of the specific tools, but just to give a brief summary of some of the things that the ACLU is involved in the courts and elsewhere. We help represent individuals in civil lawsuits challenging government misconduct and discrimination. We co-counsel sometimes with defense attorneys. We aren't general criminal defense attorneys ourselves, but we sometimes can provide specialized assistance in certain cases. We work often with other organizations to file amicus briefs in criminal or civil cases where we can highlight the issues that really have an impact across a wide swath of cases, like the discrimination that we're seeing in many of the prosecutions flowing out of the China initiative. We also pursue FOIA requests in an effort to obtain more information about government activities. And we publish materials and conduct advocacy, including things like Know Your Rights that I know we'll get to more. So that's a quick overview. And back to you, Mike.
And you mentioned FISA, which is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act for people who don't know it, which is a tool that was created in the 1970s to target foreign spies, but increasingly is used in cases that don't involve foreign spies, but rather our fellow Americans. Senator Lee, welcome. Thank you again for being here. Typically, when we think of the legal responses to a particular problem, we think about the courts and lawsuits and defending yourself against charges, but legislatures obviously play a very key role, not just in creating the policies and the laws that we follow, but also in conducting oversight of executive branch activities, like the Justice Department and the FBI in this case. Can you explain why it's important for community members to devote time and resources to legislative advocacy? You're muted, Senator.
Technicalities here.
No worries.
Thank you so much for your wonderful body of work, but also for the panelists for your work too, your leadership in this issue. But also I'd like to thank the sponsoring organizations because you're getting the information out about this and you're performing a great public service. And I'd like to answer that. Along with the separation of powers, our framers, they created a system of checks and balances that were designed to protect and safeguard the people against tyranny. And this was to ensure that no branch could seize or exercise excessive power. And we have those branches of government for good reasons, namely to prevent injustices and also to create that balance that's so essential. And the enormous devastation to the reputations, the careers and families of those innocent scientists of Chinese and Asian descent caused by the China initiative merely highlights and necessitates why it is so critical that we have this balance of power. And our congressional and state legislatures not only serve an important oversight role to ensure transparency, accountability, and fairness, but they're also charged with the role of formulating, passing laws to protect the rights and civil liberties of all of us, all individuals. And unlike the other branches of government, we in the legislatures, we are accountable to the people who elected and entrusted us to be their champions and their voice. And we have a duty to ensure that they are protected against any sort of injustices. And we view that the overzealous and broad sweep of the FBI's counterintelligence efforts and the NIH's and other entities related actions, they've not only resulted in major civil rights violations, but they've also impaired and hurt America's ability to be that global leader in medical innovations that can save lives, especially during this horrible pandemic. And while we strongly support efforts to safeguard America's interests and prosecute those wrongdoers, it is really a grave injustice to target, stereotype, or place under suspicion an entire ethnic group, as Professor Wu had indicated. And as we know to date, according to my information, all the congressional hearings have just focused on the espionage threat, but not have addressed any of the egregious civil rights violations of those innocent scientists whose lives and careers and reputations have been ruined and destroyed. And we don't even know what standards the FBI or the Justice Department have been initiating. What are the standards for initiating an investigation or making a charge? I believe that they don't even understand the science that they're investigating or what the protocols are used in research or science. I know in the bioscience field, international collaboration and exchange have been for decades encouraged by NIH and other research entities. Now, this type of activity, which has led to medical breakthroughs, are being criminalized without any kind of clarity, direction, guidelines, or consistency or standards. And so many of our scientists are falling into this trap. And why would they want to continue helping and serving our country under these circumstances? So many of these scientists, they've spent a lifetime of work devoted to developing these medical breakthroughs, and which have helped America be that global leader in science and technology. And they are part of the solution to the United States global challenges, not the threat. And I'm so proud, of course, that NIH is located in my district. Our scientists around the nation and are working very hard to advance science, and including those that are also in my district or in parts of my county in Maryland. And I would say this is one of the most important issues, not only in our AAPI community, but also in the scientific, research, and civil rights community, because it affects all of us as Americans. And this has galvanized such national support. A congressional hearing, we believe, will shine light on these possible unfair discriminatory policies and major civil rights violations. And as you know, just to update everyone, some of you have already heard this before, on February 1st of this year, I and Terry Lehrman provided my former state Senate colleague and current US Congressman Jamie Raskin a letter requesting a congressional hearing that would shine light on these violations and unfair profiling of our scientists. It was a letter signed by many prominent scientists, many AAPI leaders, civil rights leaders, and organizations, including such prominent leaders that we have in our community as former Washington State Governor and US Commerce Secretary and US Ambassador to China, Gary Locke, former US Secretary of Energy and Nobel Laureate, Dr. Stephen Chu, in Maryland, our former University of Maryland President, Dr. Wallace Lowe, and Dr. Robert Gallo, who those in the bioscience community know who he is, and many others. And we earlier had 77 Nobel laureates send a letter about their concerns about this very issue. And I just want to give you an update regarding our request for the hearing. Regarding this hearing, we've been working for about a month and a half, and we're in the final stages of working with the House committee staff and Congressman Jamie Raskin's office. They are vetting people as possible witnesses right now. And there's been tremendous, tremendous interest from all over the country, but also from all different communities, and particularly the research community. And we expect the process to close shortly. And our team, I have to say, is very optimistic. Of course, the huge surge in this anti-Asian American hate crimes has really shaken our community. And as Dr. Wu said, we're treated as foreigners in our very own country. And we and people of color and people from all backgrounds, we built America. We have made major contributions in all aspects and fields. And we've even served in the US Armed Forces, like my very own father, who was a World War II US Navy veteran who defended freedom on the perilous Atlantic and Pacific during what I would say the darkest period in the history of our world, and was part of what they call the greatest generation. So as a country, America is a work in progress, but so are our laws. So we have to change laws when they're flawed. We did so, this is nothing new, we did so when we passed major civil rights, voting rights, and immigration laws, reforms. So your participation, it's so important to us. It's very important that you work with us, partner with us as legislators with us, so that we can pass very good laws, but we need your input too. We need to pass laws to empower and uplift all our different communities. And you can participate also in community outreach and information campaigns, and also use social media. And of course, efforts to support the Yellow Whistle Project. Okay, and I think Professor Agnes Shu Tang, I commend her right now for doing this project, and she's a professor at Columbia University, and I think many of you have already spoken about her. But some may argue that we can't change things, but if you don't stand up, you don't speak up and participate, we can't move forward. And we can address this injustice as just we did. We've done this in Maryland. This is nothing new. This session, we were the first state in the union to pass major police reform bills to address hundreds of years of systemic racism, injustice, and inequality in our criminal justice system. Why? Because we listen to you. We listen to our constituents. We listen to the advocates. We know if we don't address this issue now, our children and grandchildren will have to deal with it. So you really can make a difference. And I've spoken up on the Senate floor many times to ask our colleagues to join us in this fight. And they listened. My Senate President, Bill Ferguson, and our House Speaker, Adrian Jones, just that. And they sent a very strong and clear message. So I'm also very hopeful because bipartisan bill to fight anti-Asian attacks introduced by U.S. Senator Mazie Hirono and Congresswoman Grace Meng just passed the U.S. Senate by 94-1, something that I thought would never happen in my lifetime, that there's a bipartisan bill that Congress was able, or at least the Senate was able to get back. But in closing, as the history of our country, as America attests, we can unite, work together, and we can confront with your help and overcome the gravest of adversities, and we'll get through this and the pandemic together, and we'll be even stronger. And I thank you, Michael German, for allowing me to join this esteemed panel.
We're enriched by your participation, so thanks. Finally, for John, Asian Americans have led the fight for civil rights in this country for decades, both for their own communities and very prominently when other communities are targeted. Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, and other Asian and Chinese American groups have been raising the alarm about the China Initiative from the very beginning, not least by co-sponsoring this webinar and many other ways. Can you talk about the programs that the Asian community is establishing or activating to address the harms from this type of national security racial profiling?
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. And let me put this in context, because I think Frank, Senator Lee, and Patrick have all set the stage for what is happening in our community, some of the issues that are happening in our community. And what happens, right, obviously, is as our community is reacting with pain, reacting with anger, sort of it's upon all of us to figure out where we go from there, how to create solutions from all of that. And so that's where an organization like mine comes in, but frankly, where all of our different organizations come in to help provide those solutions. So let me talk about the solutions in 3 buckets very quickly. Obviously, I want to get into more of a conversation with everyone. And also talk about how people can lean in. So when I think about how to respond in this moment to the racial profiling of Chinese American scientists and academics, I think about it in terms of education, I think about it in terms of representation, and I think about it in terms of advocacy. So on the education side is to make sure that all of our community, especially the academic scientific community, knows what their rights are. A number of the panelists here, actually, frankly, I think all the panelists here have done those types of webinars, done those types of talks about what the rights of scientists are in situations like that. The fact that they need a lawyer, the fact that they don't have to talk to FBI, and the fact that certainly they need to work with their university because their university has certain obligations to them with respect to what is happening to them. So that's one piece, is to make sure that our community is educated about what their rights are, and so that they can respond on their own. Second piece then is representation. One of the things that Professor Wu talked about is the fact that a lot of people in our community, when they get the knock on the door from the FBI, or they get an inquiry from their university about ties to a Chinese university, they're not sure what to do. And unfortunately, in certain cases, they believe that quite legitimately, they didn't do anything wrong. There's no harm in talking to the FBI, or there's no harm in talking to the university. Unfortunately, that's part of the game that's being played by the FBI, other law enforcement agencies, is they try to trap you. And I don't mean to be so pejorative or judgmental, but this is part of, and Mike, you know this well, this is part of the game that's played. They will try to trap you in a misstatement. You misremember when you went to China. You misremember sort of exactly how much you were paid to appear at a symposium. And then if you sign an affidavit or sign something that is inaccurate, then they use that against you as a perjury charge or as a false statement charge. And so the crux of it is this, is that you do need legal representation. This was one big gap that we found in our community, is people that were really qualified for these types of cases, because frankly, cases involving economic espionage under this rubric of China Initiative are pretty specialized cases. They're not garden variety civil cases. They're not your real estate cases. They're not your family law cases. They're not even your DUI or garden variety criminal cases. And so what we tried to do is create a group of attorneys that have experience representing individuals in these types of circumstances. Also attorneys that have other attorneys that would have immigration experience, that would have employment experience, that can help provide that sort of legal support network that's necessary for individuals facing situations like this. So the quick answer there also is, if you do have legal questions, if you have been contacted by FBI or you think you will, I would ask people to contact us. The number is 202-935-6014. We use a Signal app because that protects confidentiality and privacy. So that's a platform that you could use on your cell phone or smartphone. But contact us and we can walk through what your rights are. But then just as importantly, make sure that we get the legal representation that you need. The third piece is advocacy. And Senator Lee, Frank, and Patrick have also talked a little bit about that. That advocacy takes form in a number of different ways. First is, as Senator Lee talked about, in Congress, having hearings, having oversight hearings, sort of asking these questions, making sure our impacted individuals, our advocates, can raise these issues publicly so that we can get some change in the policy. Now that we have a new administration with the Biden administration, a new attorney general, although we have the same FBI director, we do see a possibility for talking to this new administration about whether it is appropriate to put a halt to this China initiative, talk about the dangers of what this China initiative has done. And certainly that is something that we've tried to start put into the works and see where that takes us. Certainly in initial discussions, this administration, although they still recognize the challenges that the Chinese government presents to the United States, I think they also recognize the damage that racial profiling does to the United States as a whole. And so we don't know where that conversation will go, but this is another place where all of us speaking out will help move that needle towards a different place. And then the last place where advocacy comes up is in the courtrooms. And Patrick talked about filing what's called amicus briefs. These are friend of the court briefs that organizations like mine, like Patrick's, like the Brennan Center, where Michael is at, provide a really sort of point of view about separate from the case, why these issues are important to the general public and why the court should think about some of the issues, bigger issues that they present. Regardless of the guilt or innocence of this individual, there are certain things that we in the community would ask when they are looking at cases like that. And so it's important to lift our voices there. And so that goes to, in conclusion, that actually goes to Senator Lee's sort of concept of separation of powers, the three branches of government, right? So we talk about congressional oversight, congressional hearings. We talk about advocating with the administration, the executive branch, on changes that can be made there. And we talk about advocating in the courts, within the legal system, as to what these court cases actually look like. And with that, I'm happy to engage in this conversation.
Yeah.
Questions.
Great. Thank you very much. That's excellent information. And part of what we need for that hearing, for that advocacy, is information to measure the scope of the problem and stories necessary to tell these stories to policymakers in a way that makes it clear these are human beings that are being impacted and not just numbers on a spreadsheet. What kind of efforts are being made to collect that information, to identify the cases, to make sure that we understand the scope of the problem? And this can be to anyone, but John, go ahead.
Sure. So our organization, again, in conjunction with a number of the organizations here, is really trying to do a deep dive. Now, the reality is when you're dealing with FBI and DOJ, unless there's an indictment presented, in other words, charges are filed or the beginning of charges are filed, A lot of this is not public information. Some of it we can obtain through what Patrick talked about, FOIA requests, what are called Freedom of Information Act requests. So you can tease out some of that information. And some of the preliminary results that we've looked at, cases that have been formally designated or we see a reference to the China initiative, out of 60 some cases, only about a quarter of them actually involve Economic Espionage Act charges. So that starts to tell us something about what these cases look like. So there's one piece on the data that we want because the data tells a story. The other piece, which I think is very important for our audience members, especially the scientists and academics that are watching this, is data matters, but stories matter too. You know, if you want to move the needle in terms of policy changes, both are necessary because that data goes a certain way to getting people to understand the scope of the issue, but really is the personal stories that individual lawmakers, individual executives can connect with that will really bring that home, if you will. And so sort of if you are someone that has been impacted by this, reach out to one of us, talk to us about it, and we'll find out about how you're willing to share your story. But these stories are valuable as well in telling the story about what is happening to our community.
Great. And Frank, often, and I do this as well, I tend to refer to the China Initiative because it's a Justice Department program in the terms of a criminal investigation and prosecution. But as we know, Patrick, you made a reference to a statement by FBI Director Christopher Wray, who suggests that the Chinese government's espionage against the United States is a whole of government effort that needs a whole of government response. And therefore, that the US government wants to activate other elements of the government to participate in this scrutiny of Chinese scientists and Chinese technologists. And that particularly tends to focus on academia. You know, what have you seen as far as academic leaders understanding what the government is asking of them and what they need to do to protect their faculty and students from unjust scrutiny?
That's the other problem. The standards have changed so fast, there's a lack of clarity. Some things that were permissible at the time that they were done, not just permissible, but being encouraged by federal government granting agencies. Find a partner in China. You know, if you travel back in time 5 years, you only have to go back 5 years. Every major university and every minor university, it didn't matter what their size, what their prestige was, they wanted a Chinese partner. They wanted to recruit Chinese scientists, Chinese students. They were gung-ho to do that. And then suddenly it changed because of global politics. So there's just a lack of certainty. And when the China Initiative was announced, the Department of Justice said it was a new enforcement priority. Those aren't my words, that's the Department of Justice speaking. And they held a big press conference. Why did they do that? Because they were taking laws that, yes, they were on the books, but they were not an enforcement priority. So suddenly everything ratcheted upward and caught all these folks unawares. Now, institutions have responded differently. Some have indemnified, meaning they've helped to cover the legal costs and the potential losses of their faculty members, but others have summarily fired them, tried to detenure them and do all sorts of things, even in cases where there are not criminal charges. So there's been a very wide range. And you should be aware, if you're watching this, it isn't just if the FBI knocks at your door. It could be the department chair, if you're a professor, even if you're a distinguished professor, and says, you know, I'd like to talk to you. The HR department, an internal research department coming, and that could have very severe consequences. So something I do want to be clear about. I would not for a moment suggest that everyone is running around being bigoted toward Asian Americans or toward ethnic Chinese. Sometimes we don't know. Are they racist? Are they not? And that debate to me often is pointless because the effect is racial. Whether the intent was racist, the effect is racial. And you see that in just the disproportionate numbers and the chilling effect. That's a crazy thing. There are a lot of folks now who are just being deterred from coming who could be Americans, who could contribute, like all those Nobel Prize winners. And folks here who want to be Americans, their kids were born here, but they're feeling they just can't. They're going to face that glass ceiling. There's all this bias, they're the physical attacks. They've just had it because this nation, for them, hasn't lived up to our ideals. So when I talk about this, I always make clear, I'm not asking for anyone to extend Asian Americans or ethnic Chinese anything special. I'm just asking that we live up to what has beckoned the world over for generations, the American dream, the ideal that each of us will be able to prove ourselves. And so if we work together, but we have to work on this, we'll be able to realize those ideals.
Excellent. And Patrick, we mentioned the case of Professor Shi that I know the ACLU is involved in. What other kind of efforts is the ACLU involved in around this issue of the China initiative?
Sure. So as you mentioned, we have Professor Shi's case, which is has been going on for a number of years, and will continue.
Can you just give it just a very short brief on his story and what the case is about? Yeah,
of course. Many people on today's webinar probably are a bit familiar with his family story. But in 2015, Professor Shi, who is a physics professor at Temple University, was arrested and charged with wire fraud based on claims that he had communicated with academic scientific colleagues in China about a technology that was not classified or in any way a government secret, but that was subject to a private agreement. And the FBI claimed that he had improperly shared that information with others. It turned out that the FBI was completely wrong about what technology was described in the emails that they had reviewed and relied on in charging him. And so, to Frank's point, one of the ways we see the effects is in the race to conclusions, the race to find guilt, even on the basis of science that doesn't prove to be scientific conclusions that don't prove to be accurate in the FBI's view. But it also came out in the course of that prosecution that Professor Shi had been subject to this Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act surveillance that we talked about earlier, in which the government uses in cases involving espionage, involving spies. And to have it emerge in the context of that particular case was quite shocking, especially as the case as a whole fell apart. And Professor Shi and his family now have a civil lawsuit represented by a civil rights law firm in Philadelphia and the ACLU seeking redress for what they experienced at the hands of the FBI. And of course, he's not alone. Sherry Chen, who was mentioned, there are a number of other cases that have fallen apart. In one of the studies that I think Frank mentioned, they also looked at how many of the cases there either were dismissed or resulted in not guilty verdicts, and found a disproportionate number in the context of these economic espionage and investigations of people of Asian descent. So the problem is widespread. Professor Shi and his family have been incredibly outspoken in telling their story and highlighting the injustice that they were subject to and encouraging others to speak out. And so, I shared in the chat a piece that Joyce Shi, Professor Shi's daughter, published yesterday. But in terms of other efforts, we also have FOIA requests, one of which we have with AAJC, seeking information not just from the FBI, but from the other government agencies that are part of this effort to scrutinize researchers and scientists. NIH and the National Science Foundation have been very involved in those efforts. And we want to learn more about what standards they're applying, how they're going about examining individuals, and what types of pressure they're putting on research institutions to turn over information, including things like emails that are involved their researchers and other types of information. So those are a few of our efforts.
Thanks. Senator Lee, many people have never spoken to their elected representatives before and don't really know how the legislature is organized, who would be the appropriate person to talk to about a particular issue. What kind of advice can you give about how to get in touch with your elected representatives, both in their state legislatures, but also in the federal government?
It's very easy. You know, unfortunately, a lot of people don't even know who their Congress people are, much less state legislators. But I think if we're going to be able to change things around, I would say we have to, everybody has to get involved. You can't be passive spectators. You have to be active participants in the political process, because there has to be an awareness, if you don't get involved, that horrible things can happen to you and your families, and that you will not have the rights and liberties that are enjoyed by everybody else. And we know this because we've experienced this, Asian Americans in this country, and also people of color. So it's important that you contact us, that you find out who is your state legislator, your senator, your House representatives, or your congressperson, because we listen to our constituents, we listen to community leaders and advocates, and I know I do. I have a great staff that we're on it. As soon as you call me or call my office, we're on it. We are responsive because you elected us, okay? You elected us to be your voice, your champion, to fight for you. And I know that, I know in my state, I have a great congressman in Jamie Raskin and Senator Chris Van Hollen and Senator Ben Cardin, but we have also other great congressional members too. And they are more than willing to hear from you. And my office is always open. You can always get me at, you can get me at my email, susan.lee@senate.state.md.us, or you can contact me and we'll be on it. But you have to get involved, because laws and policies will be drafted, formulated, and passed with your input or without your input. And if it doesn't have your input, then you're not going to have equal justice for the law. And that's why it's so important. And it's also important that we have elected officials that not only look like us, but understand our issues, but also those that may not be Asian American, but are our champions. So anyway, I hope that answers your question, but please get in touch with us. That's what we're here for.
Thank you very much. John, let me ask you this discussion is happening obviously when we've seen an alarming rise in hate crimes, which is why the Yellow Whistle campaign is important. But how much is there a connection between this heated rhetoric around China as a national security threat, and particularly naming a Justice Department program, the China Initiative, in creating that anti-Asian or increasing that anti-Asian animus?
There's a direct through line. On one level, these are separate issues in the sense that how you address anti-Asian hate and some of the violence that we're seeing in our community looks different than what we're doing with respect to the China Initiative. But why I say that there's a through line is that this all boils down to one of the stereotypes or myths that we have to break, which is that of the perpetual foreigner. This notion that no matter how long Asian Americans have been in this country, whether we were born here or not, we are seen as a foreigner. We're seen not to be trusted. We're seen as the other. In the case of anti-Asian hate, that results in us being blamed for COVID-19. And because of that, it is okay to target us and to target us with violence. In the case of the China Initiative, it is because we are treated as suspect with respect to national security, and therefore it is okay to target us. And let's also be clear that these two will conflate at the same time, conflate as well. Even when COVID-19 is quote unquote under control, these geopolitical tensions that we have with the Chinese government will remain. And as long as those will remain, that level of hate, that level of racism, that level of xenophobia that we have seen will continue into the future. One of the things that I sometimes remark to people is, for those that know the story of Vincent Chin was a person who was murdered in 1982 by two out-of-work auto workers in Detroit. He was murdered because at that time, there was a trade war with Japan regarding automobiles. What we are faced with right now is the exact same thing. We have trade tensions with the government of China, and the collateral damage is citizens of the United States. So in that sense, on both of these fronts, we need to be absolutely careful and absolutely nuanced in how we talk about these issues.
Thank you. Patrick, John mentioned xenophobia being part of the driver of this, and what we see both in the war on terrorism overreaches and here is that a lot of the impact is on people who are traveling back to the United States through a port of entry. And there's a question about what their rights are at that point of entry, where the government agent asks to have their laptop or the password to their cell phone, and they feel that they're being mistreated because there's no justification for that kind of a search. What can you explain about their rights at a port of entry?
Thanks, Mike. We hear about these concerns all the time, and in this context and in other contexts. And that's in part because in many instances, the government really tries to take advantage of people's vulnerability when they're at the border, when they're getting off a long flight, they're trying to come back into the country. The government takes the position that many of the legal rules that apply elsewhere inside the United States don't apply the same way at the border, and especially when it comes to searches, both of physical belongings, but also of devices. And the ACLU has a lawsuit right now that's challenging the government's theory of what it's entitled to do in searching electronic devices specifically at the border, which obviously contain a vast amount of people's private information, personal details, family photos, academic research. But what people do at a particular moment is quite fact specific. It depends what types of devices you're traveling with, how sensitive you view the information on them, and what kind of inconvenience you're willing to endure to really do the most to protect your rights. So we have, the ACLU has a set of Know Your Rights pages that apply to border searches, and I'll add that into the chat so people can access it easily. Certainly the government can try to seize devices at the border and to retain them. You know, we're fighting those efforts, but the government claims that ability, and so the best thing to do is, if you can travel without that sensitive information, if you can leave it at home, if that's possible for you, that's often the best decision to make. And then beyond that, I think you would want to look to the ACLU's resources and other organizations like EFF to see how to handle that situation based on your own circumstances. So I'll add that, a link to that here.
Thank you. We mentioned Professor Xi's case and Sherry Chen, and both of those were actually before the announcement of this China initiative. So one of the things we know that this anti-Asian profiling in national security cases wasn't brand new. But Frank, do you think it's important for the Biden administration to formally end the China initiative, even as we struggle to find justice on the individual cases, and why?
It would be great for us to advocate for that, to advocate for a change in the strategy. And let me be clear, we can and should and must protect American interests against foreign influence, against espionage. This just isn't the right way to do it, and causes all sorts of problems and betrays American ideals. High officials have said expressly that they believe all or almost all Chinese students coming here to the United States are spies. Former President Trump, for example, gave a speech shocking those in attendance in which he made that claim in 2019. It was reported in the press, but the story wasn't followed up on. Many of the activities engaged in by people are innocent. Sherry Chen was visiting her elderly, ill mother. That's great human conduct. We should all spend more time with our mothers. And then coming back to the United States, she was identified by a co-worker as a foreigner, which she was not. An immigrant she had naturalized as a United States citizen, exactly as we tell immigrants they should do and they aspire to do. So some of the conduct that people engage in It's good, it's commendable conduct, even finding research partners and collaborating. That's how scientists do their work. So many scientists have pointed out, separate from civil rights, this is destroying American science because it's contrary to scientific ideals and scientific process. I'll just say one more thing. I'm going to demonstrate something that would cause suspicion, right? I'm not very fluent in Mandarin. It would be embarrassing to my ancestors, but I'm going to say something for those Mandarin speakers. I can say this because I've practiced it, but it's the sort of thing that would attract suspicion. 美国的政府现在觉得中国的学生他们都是间谍. All right, what did I just say? I just said American government officials now regard Chinese students as being all spies. All I did was translate the headlines from the statements that were being made until very recently. The Biden administration has done great things. It's issued statements against anti-Asian violence. Legislation has been passed. The tone from the White House has changed 180 degrees. So let's hope that they'll see that the China initiative has been misguided from the get-go.
Very helpful. There's a great question from the audience for Senator Lee. It says, if my elected legislators do not express my perspective, do you still advise that I contact them? In other words, if they might.
Yes, absolutely. Because if they are not held accountable and they don't know that they're doing something wrong, they're going to continue that that conduct and to say those. I have to say, words really matter. And when you have like former President Donald Trump and some of those that are still in high office and high trust say certain things that are very dangerous and xenophobic, so if they say it so many times, there are so many people that believe it. And we cannot have high public officials saying those things because they sanction things like the China initiative and all the damage that goes along with it. So we as citizens, we need to hold our elected officials accountable. So when they say things like this, and even if you don't agree with them, you got to tell them that. You got to tell them that what they're saying is flawed and not right. And it causes scapegoating. And it's dangerous for America because when you attack us, you're attacking all Americans and all the values and all the things that we believe in. So this is, to me, it's an American issue. And so I would encourage everyone, just go ahead and contact them and let them tell, or elect them out of office, okay? You have the power to do that. You have the power to advocate and also to form coalitions with other communities, to elect elected officials that will be accountable to you, that will represent you and be your champions.
Excellent, thank you very much. We had planned on going for another 15 minutes, but I'm mindful that President Biden has an important speech to give tonight. So I want to make sure all of you can go see it as well as our audience members. So let me just do a last round quickly. If there's any other issues that you think you definitely want to mention to make sure our audience knows about. I'll start with John.
Sure, thanks. And I think what you're hearing from all of the speakers tonight is please do get involved. Get involved in all of these different ways, whether it is contacting your legislators. I absolutely agree with Senator Lee. Even if you're a legislator or someone that doesn't agree with you, you know that they don't agree with you, their staff are still taught to put down that check mark as to what your viewpoint is. And that does make a difference because there are no check marks on that other side of the ledger. They're going to continue with that racist rhetoric and feel that there's no repercussions. At least you need to check that behavior. But then also think about within your community, organizing some of these know your rights type seminars, organizing these discussions. Think about letter writing campaigns. This goes along the lines of contact your members of Congress. Those can be effective. And all of that gives us a collective voice, gives us as advocates also an additional boost in saying, look, we are speaking for the people. When I am coming here to meet with you, Attorney General Garland, I'm not just representing John Yang, not just representing Advancing Justice AAJC, I'm representing the hopes and dreams of 23 million Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders.
Great. Patrick?
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I just want to second what John said and what Frank and Senator Lee said in terms of keeping the pressure on your legislators, on the Biden administration. I'm optimistic, like Frank is, that the Biden administration will change course. But I have to say that, someone in the questions mentioned that there was a new indictment in Illinois this week, and at the very bottom of DOJ's press release, it said this prosecution is part of the ongoing China initiative. Being spearheaded by the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the National Security Division. And it's disturbing that we're almost 100 days or maybe 100 days into this administration and that hasn't been changed. So we want to see meaningful change. We need people's help to do it, to get pressure, to have public advocacy. And if you are encountering, individual issues, related to the China initiative, please do reach out to one of our organizations. And we really want to be able to help people who are impacted. So thank you for watching tonight.
And Frank?
These are the principles that drew us or our ancestors to these shores. These are American ideals. And so for everyone who's Asian American, who's Chinese American watching this, build bridges. There are African Americans. There are so many friends of ours, Latinx people who are Muslim, who face the same issues. It has a different face on it. But if we are to succeed, it's by building coalitions. That's how a diverse democracy works.
Thanks. And Senator Lee, I'll give you the last one.
Okay, I concur with all my fellow panelists, I think, but we have to still be vigilant. We still have to advocate on issues that are important to our community so we can empower and uplift our community. I am hopeful because we have a new president. President Joe Biden has come out and denounced all these anti-Asian attacks and hate crimes. And he has done this many, many times, and he probably will do it tonight, hopefully. And also, we have a new vice president, first woman, first Black and Asian American vice president. And she's lived these experiences. She's brings a new perspective to the top office because she not only knows the issues that are faced by mainstream, but she knows those issues faced by a woman, but also a person of color. And so we need to continue to support legislators and vice president that understands our issues, but it's not over yet. As Professor Wu said, we've just been in like 100 days and we cannot lag behind in our advocacy. We have to continue because we have to let the president and vice president know about some of the damage caused by this China initiative. Is it effective? Do we still need it? Has it achieved its purpose? So get involved, stay engaged, and always feel free to contact your legislators and your elected officials. And I thank you again, Mike German, and my esteemed panelists for all your presentations and for this wonderful webinar.
And I'll second that. Thank you, Senator Lee, Frank Wu, Patrick Toomey, John Yang, for an excellent discussion. I'd like to also thank the Brennan Center's co-sponsoring organizations, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, the APA Justice Task Force, United Chinese Americans, and Asian Pacific Islander American Public Affairs. And finally, I'd like to thank the audience members for their interest in all of these webinars. They've had a great turnout, so thank you for tuning in. And for more information about the next webinar, please take a look at the APA Justice website and sign up for any alerts from all of our sponsoring organizations and from the ACLU so you can be aware of these issues as they're happening. And please support all of their work. Thank you very much.